Let me ask you something. If your mom or dad suddenly needed assisted living, memory care, or significant in-home care tomorrow, would you know how you were going to pay for it? Most families don't. And that's not because they're irresponsible. It's because most families don't start thinking about senior care until something happens. A fall, a hospitalization, a dementia diagnosis, a caregiver becoming overwhelmed, or a doctor telling the family that living independently may no longer be safe. And then suddenly, a conversation that wasn't supposed to happen for years is happening right now. One of the things I've learned after helping families navigate senior transitions is that most families aren't actually struggling to choose a care option. They're struggling to understand how they're going to pay for it. Today, we're going to talk about the 3 ways families typically pay for senior care, why so many families feel overwhelmed when these conversations begin, and how understanding your options earlier can help you make better decisions under less pressure. Hi, I'm Dale Corpus, a Senior Transition Strategist based in the San Francisco Bay Area. I help families navigate senior care decisions when a home is involved, guiding them through housing, real estate, and home equity options so they can make informed decisions during some of life's most challenging transitions. This is another episode of Sandwich Generation Solutions, powered by the Simplify Senior Transitions podcast, where we bring clarity to decisions that are too often made under pressure. Let's dive in. One of the biggest misconceptions families have is thinking they're making a single decision. They're not. In reality, they're making several decisions at the same time. They're trying to determine what type of care is needed. They're trying to determine where their parents should live. They're trying to determine how to pay for it. And very often, they're trying to determine what role the family home plays in the equation. That's why these situations feel so overwhelming, because what appears to be a care decision is also a housing decision and a financial decision, all happening simultaneously. In fact, one of my favorite ways to describe this is most families think they're making a real estate decision. In reality, they're making a care decision, a financial decision, and a housing decision all at the same time. And before we talk about funding options, I think it's important to start with a question. Not, what should we do with the house? Not, should we sell? Not, should we get a reverse mortgage? Not, should mom move into assisted living? The first question should be, what are we trying to accomplish? Because once the goal becomes clear, the available options often become much easier to evaluate. For example, is the goal to help a parent remain at home as long as possible? Is the goal to move closer to family? Is the goal to reduce caregiver stress? Is the goal to preserve certain assets? Is the goal to create the safest environment possible? Different goals often lead to different solutions, and that's why there is rarely a one-size-fits-all answer. It's about finding the right strategy for the right family at the right time. And once the objective becomes clear, we can begin discussing resources. And generally speaking, most families fund senior care through one or more of 3 categories: income, assets, and home equity. And here's the important part. Most families end up using a combination of all 3. Let's start with income. Many retirees receive income from Social Security. Some receive pensions. Others have annuities or retirement distributions. These income sources may cover some or even most monthly expenses. But here's where many families become surprised. The cost of care can escalate quickly. Maybe a parent initially needs a few hours of home care each week. Then it becomes several hours per day, then every day, or perhaps a parent moves from independent living to assisted living, or from assisted living to memory care. The care needs change and the financial needs change with them. What once felt manageable can suddenly become much more expensive. That's why income alone isn't always enough, which brings us to the second category: Assets. Assets include things like savings accounts, investment accounts, retirement accounts, long-term care insurance benefits, and other financial resources accumulated over a lifetime. Many families rely heavily on assets to help supplement income and pay for care. In some situations, those resources can provide tremendous flexibility, but they also require thoughtful planning. One thing I frequently see is families focusing only on today's costs rather than long-term sustainability. If care is needed for several years rather than several months, the planning conversation becomes very different. That's why understanding the full financial picture matters. Now, let's talk about the third category, home equity. For many families, this is the largest asset they have, yet it's often the last conversation they want to have because homes are emotional. They're filled with memories, they're connected to independence, they're connected to family identity, and sometimes they're connected to future inheritance expectations as well. But when a family needs care, the home often becomes one of the most important parts of the planning discussion. In some cases, selling the home may make the most sense. The proceeds can be used to help fund care, simplify finances, and reduce responsibilities. In other situations, keeping the home may be the better choice, and sometimes families explore ways to use home equity strategically while allowing the senior to remain in the home. A reverse mortgage is one example, but I want to be very clear about something. A reverse mortgage is not where I start. It's one of the several tools that may or may not fit depending on the family's goals. I think that's important because many people immediately assume that discussing home equity means someone is trying to sell them a particular solution. That's not how I approach these conversations. The goal is not to force a solution. The goal is to understand the situation, then evaluate the available options, and then determine which path makes the most sense. I've worked with families who sold the home. I've worked with families who kept the home. I've worked with families who used home equity strategically to help fund care while allowing a parent to age in place. Each situation was different. Each family had different priorities, and each solution was built around those priorities. Another mistake I see frequently is waiting too long to have these conversations. Many families don't discuss care planning until a crisis occurs. A hospitalization, a fall, a diagnosis, a sudden decline. When that happens, families often feel rushed, and rushed decisions usually create additional stress. The families who tend to navigate these transitions most successfully aren't necessarily the families with the most money. They're often the families that started planning earlier. They understand the available resources. They've had conversations about goals. They've discussed preferences, and they've given themselves time to evaluate options before urgency takes over. That doesn't eliminate the emotional challenges, but it often leads to better decisions. So today we talked about the 3 ways families typically pay for senior care: income, assets, and home equity. And we also talked about why the first question isn't, what should we do with the house? The first question is, what are we trying to accomplish? Because when the goal becomes clear, the possible paths become clearer as well. And that's really what senior transition planning is all about. Helping families understand their options so they can make thoughtful decisions before pressure and urgency take over. This has been another episode of Sandwich Generation Solutions powered by the Simplify Senior Transitions podcast. If you're navigating a senior transition right now and trying to determine the best path for an aging parent, visit simplifyseniortransitions.com. You'll find resources designed to help families navigate senior care decisions, housing decisions, and funding options when a home is involved. And if this episode brought you clarity, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Reviews help more families find this information before a stressful situation becomes a crisis. I'm Dale Corpus, and I'll see you on the next episode.